this is the next step we will do on our shirts. What you can do is you can have your pleats, and where you make your pleats on the sleeves is something that your pattern will identify. You know, you will have notches, and your pattern will tell you how wide and where your pleats are. And then when you are folding your pleats, make sure your pleats are folded and your pin is covering at least 1.5 inches of the length of the pleat, because otherwise sometimes what I've seen is people end up doing like pleats in a weird way, and then its direction is off and it looks crooked.
What did you say about 1.5 inches?
You know how this pin is? Like, make sure you fold your pleat
Okay.
and then have your pin. You can hand baste it here, or you can have your pin to where your pin is at least covering 1.5 inches of the pleat
Oh, I
length,
see.
so that when you sew on it, it stays in the proper
Okay, I
direction
see what you're talking
and the
about.
proper folds.
Okay.
Okay, now I'm going to show you 2 different ways of sewing the sleeve into the armhole. One is the actual technically correct way of doing the set-in sleeve. The other is one also is a set-in sleeve, but it's more of a quick, less labor-intensive way of doing the sleeve. And a lot of men's shirts will have the sleeve sewn to where you sew in the sleeve to the armhole first, and then you do the sleeve seam and the side seam as one continuous seam, right? Whereas a lot of women's shirts will have the side seam done first, and there's a sleeve seam, and then do the technically correct way of setting in the sleeve into the armhole.
Does it make a difference in fit?
It doesn't make a difference in fit, but it saves you a lot of labor time because it's
okay.
easier. And then men's shirts usually have like a top stitch seam on the armhole. I don't know if you have noticed that or
Seen
not.
it, yeah.
And that makes it harder when you have the set-in sleeve. That makes it harder to do, because then you're kind of like going in a circle around the armhole. In that case, it's better to just do the sleeve, attach the sleeve to the armhole, overlock it, and then do the top stitch seam, and then do the sleeve seam and side seam as one step. So everybody knows how to pin the sleeve into the armhole. Really, there is a shoulder notch and then the sleeve cap notch. Those notches should match. I always start there. And there are notches right here in the front armhole, 1 notch on each side, and for the back there are 2 notches on each side, and that identifies the front versus the back, in case you're working with a fabric like this that doesn't really have a front or a back. Okay, and then from there on you can just pin, and then pin in between, pin it in between, and pin the end. Okay, and what side do you keep up?
Do we gather it?
Facing up. So you're gonna keep not the sleeve cap. No, we're not gonna gather this one.
Okay.
So, but there is gonna be ease. But it doesn't have as much ease to where you have to like pull the thread and do all that good stuff.
Okay.
Because I think my pattern called for a running stitch along here to ease it in.
Okay.
So that would be all right then.
If your
Yeah.
pattern is calling for, this pattern didn't call for that, and you can see that there's not too much ease in this pattern, so it worked out fine. But if your pattern calls for, it might have notches from here to here, and it might ask you to do a double stitch seam and pull the thread and do the ease.
Okay.
And if you have any problem doing that, since I can't do that on this, it's gonna run my sleeve cap smaller than the armhole, then just bring it to me and I can show you how to work that out. Okay? So, and then of course when you're sewing these 2 parts, you're gonna have your shirt, the armhole up towards you, and then the sleeve cap down. Anytime you have gathers, or especially ease, it helps to have the smaller fabric edge or part on top. So whatever seam allowance your pattern is calling for, you will sew on that seam allowance. everybody following along?
No. I'm sitting here going, huh?
So some people call it shirt sleeve, some people call it mock set-in sleeve, the way it's done, because it kind of is a set-in sleeve, but just different steps. So what you're gonna do next is, you're gonna go ahead and overlock this. We press the seam allowances away from the shirt
Away from-
because you want your sleeve to sort of cap over the shoulder. But if you're gonna do the top stitch seam here, then you need to press the seam allowances towards the shirt. Does it make sense?
Yes.
Because you're, at that point, you're top stitching, but then you're stitching the seam allowances.
So if you're
To the
top
arm.
So pull the shirt is like
then,
this.
so it's wrong.
Push everything.
So that you could do the same right
No,
along here.
it doesn't make a
And it
difference.
would
Yeah,
catch it.
Press.
But sewing won't make a difference.
But also at this point on the muslin, you don't want to necessarily do the top stitching.
Right.
You
So
do that
if
on
you
the
don't want to
finish.
do the top stitching, well, I need to press a little bit better, but if you are not in muslin, you don't have to top stitch. So
If I-
and you don't, I'm not gonna ask you to top stitch or not top stitch, that's something you can decide, based on what your pattern calls for and stuff. And if you're not doing men's shirt, you can totally skip on top stitching or edge stitching. So what I'm doing now is I'm holding the shirt front to back so that I can do the side seam and sleeve seam as one continuous seam. So I'm pinning these together.
When you're sewing, do you, when you're getting to a, like the, where the armhole would meet up and stuff with the seams, like in denim or when you're doing pants, they say to fold the seam allowance one way on this side and the other way on that side, that's so that it'll interlock with each other, you know, so you flip it.
That's a flat felt seam.
So would you do that with going underneath the
You
armhole
could.
also?
You could, and that's an example we're gonna do so that I can show you guys how the flat felt seam is done. And if that's the seam you wanna do, you can do that seam on your fashion fabric. But once again, we're not gonna do that seam on muslin because it will make it harder for you to alter if you needed to alter it later on.
I just never have the room to get the seam allowances to do that fold over the opposite so they interlock and stay flat.
Right.
And I'm like, I don't know how the hell they do it.
Did you say the industry does not do, does it this way or does not?
Industry does it this way because it's
Does it?
less labor intensive and it's less time consuming.
They do it this way, okay.
So now at this point, you're just, I'm sure this is not something
And
new
it's
to
a
you.
heck of a lot easier to do it this way than actually trying to sew a circle, a closed circle.
And I'm sure it makes sense to you when I said like top stitch seam. I think your shirt has the
Yeah.
top stitch seam.
It sure has it.
How difficult it would be if you already had the sleeve sewn into the armhole and trying to top stitch
Oh,
it.
that'd be horrible.
Especially if it's when it's gathered at the top and you have to top stitch it.
And when you're doing things in a factory, it's not just how much longer it's taking 2 minutes longer on a shirt. You have to think about if it's taking 2 minutes longer on a shirt, how much longer it's taking on 100,000 of them. Right? So that's where it will make a difference. And then it's not just that it's saving time, it's also saving you skilled labor. For doing this type of sleeve, it will need you to hire maybe not as experienced or skilled workers versus the other type of sleeve where it will gonna turn out to be a little bit more expensive labor to start with. So what will be the next step after this?
The cut.
The next step after this will obviously is gonna be overlocking the seam. So you'll just go ahead and go to the overlock machine and overlock the seam. We're not gonna do that on muslin, but we will do that on
A fashion.
the fashion fabric. So
Now,
this sleeve is done.
Does it matter when you interlock something? Does it matter if does the thread have to match the garment that you're interlocking?
On muslin it wouldn't matter, but on fashion fabric I would match it up.
Okay. It's like you don't have purple thread, so.
Go with the darker thread tone that you see. That's pretty. I've got black.
My collar is folded backwards. Alright, so the next type of sleeve, have you done a satin sleeve before? Like the